Hey there. Tonight, we slip back more than 800 years, deep into the Middle Ages, through the gates of a great stone castle, past the guards and the torches and the banners, all the way up the winding stair to the finest bedchamber in the kingdom. Because tonight, you are not visiting the medieval world. Tonight you rule it. Or at least, you are the crown of the woman who is supposed to. Tonight you become a medieval queen, anointed with holy oil, dressed in silk and ermine, married to a king you barely know, watched by a court that does not entirely trust you, and responsible, more or less personally, for the future of an entire royal dynasty. It sounds like a fairy tale. It was, in fact, one of the hardest jobs in the medieval world, wrapped in one of the most beautiful packages. The truth about life as a medieval queen? You wouldn't last a day. And before the night is over, you'll meet 3 real women who actually lived it: Eleanor of Aquitaine, Empress Matilda, and Isabella of France, queens whose true stories make the fairy tales look tame. Before we begin, take a slow breath, and if you genuinely enjoy these quiet journeys into the past, go ahead and like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly want to. There's no pressure here, ever. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight, and what time it is for you. I always love picturing all of us, scattered right across the world, settling in under the blankets together, drifting off to the same old stories. Now dim the lights, settle deep into your pillows, and let's drift back together, 800 years and more, through the castle gates, up the torchlit stair, into the world of the medieval queen. Congratulations. You have just woken up as a medieval queen. The good news is that you are, by a comfortable margin, the most important woman in the entire kingdom. You sleep in the grandest bed in the land, you are addressed on bended knee, your face is on the coins, or at least your husband's is, and when you walk into a room, everyone in it stops breathing until you've chosen a chair. The bad news is almost everything else. You were traded to this country like a shipment of extremely expensive wool. You may have met your husband for the first time roughly an hour before you married him. The entire court is convinced you're a foreign spy, and your single most important royal duty, the one your whole existence now depends upon, is to produce a son. Preferably several. Preferably yesterday. No pressure. Welcome to the Middle Ages, Your Grace. Let's see how long you last. You wake in the royal bedchamber, which is, admittedly, magnificent, and also, in the way of all medieval magnificence, slightly medieval. The bed itself is an enormous carved wooden fortress, hung all around with heavy embroidered curtains, and those curtains are not for style. They are for survival, because the room beyond them is roughly the temperature of a cave. A castle, you will quickly learn, is a military building that people happen to sleep in. The walls are stone, many feet thick, pierced by windows that are gorgeous, arched, and mostly unglazed, or glazed with panes so small and thick and green that daylight arrives looking seasick. The fire in the great hearth died sometime in the night, and the chill crept back in like it owns the place, which, frankly, it does. You are not alone, either. A medieval queen almost never is. 1 or 2 of your ladies are asleep on truckle beds near the door, and a servant is already kneeling at the hearth, coaxing the fire back with a poker and an air of quiet heroism. Privacy, you will discover, is not one of the privileges of royalty. It has not been invented yet. And you still haven't got out of bed, but we'll get to that. Getting up, when it happens, is a ceremony, because everything you do today is a ceremony. You do not simply dress. You are dressed, by your ladies, in layers, and the layers are the whole point. First, the linen shift, soft and plain, the only thing that touches your skin, and the only comfortable garment you will wear until bedtime. Then woolen hose, gartered at the knee. Then the kirtle, a long-fitted underdress, laced snug at the sides. Then the gown itself, and here is where you become a queen. Silk or fine wool in glowing color, sleeves trailing nearly to the floor, embroidered at every hem, lined and trimmed, if the season is grand, with fur, miniver, ermine, the soft white winter coats of small northern creatures reserved by actual law for people of your rank. Yes, there are laws about clothes. They are called sumptuary laws, and they exist so that no jumped-up merchant's wife can dress like you, which tells you exactly how important dressing is in this world. Your clothes are not fashion. They are a government document. Every thread announces your rank, your wealth, your husband's power, and your country's dignity. If your embroidery is shabby, that is a diplomatic incident. And you still haven't done your hair, but we'll get to the hair. The hair, as it happens, is mostly a secret. A married woman in the Middle Ages, and a queen above all, does not spill her hair loose in public like some girl in a ballad. Your hair is long, probably longer than you're imagining, and your ladies comb it out with ivory combs, braid it, coil it, pin it, and then, in the fashion of the age, cover it. Over the braids goes the veil, or the wimple that frames your face in white linen, or, on state occasions, structures we can only call architectural, padded rolls, jeweled nets called crespons, and headdresses that rise from your brow like the prow of a very confident ship. On top of everything, on the great days, sits the crown, which is heavier than it looks, colder than it looks, and worth more than several of your husband's castles put together. Your ladies smooth the veil, pinch color into your cheeks, subtly, because paint is for other sorts of women, or so everyone loudly insists while quietly using it, and hold up a polished mirror so you can inspect the result. Looking back at you is a queen. She looks calm. She looks serene. She looks like she slept beautifully. None of these things are true, but truth, you are learning, is the least of a queen's duties. And you still haven't prayed yet, and oh, you are going to pray. We'll get to that right now, actually. Because the first real appointment of every royal day is with God. Before food, before business, before anything, you go to Massachusetts. The chapel is within the castle walls, and your path to it is a small procession. You, your ladies behind you in order of rank. Everything today will be in order of rank. Get used to it. A chaplain waiting, candles lit, incense drifting up into cold stone vaults. You will hear Mass every single morning of your royal life, and on feast days, of which the medieval calendar has an astonishing number, considerably more. And here's the thing, your piety is not a private matter. It is part of the job. A queen is supposed to be the kingdom's model of devotion, endowing abbeys, collecting relics, praying visibly and often for the souls of her family and the success of her husband's ventures. The kingdom is watching how you kneel. Ambassadors will literally write home about it. So you kneel beautifully on cold stone, in 6 layers of clothing, while your stomach, empty since last night, because one does not eat before Mass, makes noises unbecoming of an anointed queen. You keep your face serene. You are getting good at serene. You will need to be. And you still haven't had breakfast, but at last, we'll get to that. Breakfast, when it finally arrives, is a quiet, almost apologetic little meal, because the Middle Ages does not really believe in breakfast. Big eating in the morning is considered slightly gluttonous, the habit of laborers and children. So you break your fast simply, in your chamber, good white bread, the finest in the kingdom, baked from the whitest flour, because even your bread has rank, a little cheese perhaps, and wine or ale. Yes, ale, possibly at 7 in the morning, and no, nobody thinks that strange. Water, unless it comes from a spring you trust with your life, is a gamble, and everyone from the scullery boy to the archbishop drinks small ale instead, which is weak, safe, and made by people who would be genuinely confused by your concerns. As you eat, the day assembles itself around you. Your ladies bring word of who has arrived at the castle overnight. A clerk hovers with letters. Somewhere below, the whole vast machine of the household, hundreds of people, all of whom answer, one way or another, to you, is already grinding into motion. Because here is what the fairy tales never mention: a queen is not a decoration. A queen is a chief executive. And your corporation is enormous, mobile, armed, and extremely opinionated. We'll get to it right now. Your household is a small kingdom in itself, and you are its sovereign. At its heart are your ladies-in-waiting, noble women, some of them from the greatest families in the land, who attend you, dress you, read with you, sew with you, sleep near you, and know absolutely everything about you. Choose them carefully, because every one of them is also a daughter, a sister, a wife of some powerful man, and everything you say in their hearing has a way of arriving, gift-wrapped, at their families' dinner tables. Around the ladies spreads the rest, your chamberlain, who runs the whole operation, your clerks, who write your letters, your chaplains, who mind your soul, your treasurer, who minds your money and loses sleep over it, grooms, pages, messengers, laundresses, seamstresses, cooks, huntsmen, falconers, minstrels, and one appointed soul whose entire career is carrying your train, so it doesn't drag through what medieval floors are famously covered in. All of these people wear your colors. All of them eat at your expense. All of them gossip constantly, magnificently, about you. A queen's household could number well over 100 souls, and it is a court within a court, with its own feuds, its own romances, its own politics, all conducted at a low hum around you, every hour of every day, like living inside a beehive that curtsies. And you still haven't found out how you got this job in the first place. But we'll get to that, because honestly, it explains everything. Here is how you became a queen. You were sold. Let's be genteel and say allied, but let's also be honest. Somewhere years ago, when you were a child, perhaps a very small child, two courts sat down over maps and treaties, weighed your bloodline, your father's armies, your dowry, and the strategic value of your homeland's friendship, and traded you to a foreign king the way great powers trade provinces. You may have been betrothed at 7. You may have been married at 12 or 14, to a man you had never seen, in a language you were still learning. Royal daughters across Europe grew up knowing this was coming, the way other children knew the harvest was coming. It was the entire point of you. A princess was the most valuable diplomatic object her kingdom possessed, a living, breathing peace treaty in a silk gown. And when you arrived in your new country, seasick, homesick, 12, you brought a dowry that could fund a war, a wardrobe chosen to impress a nation, and a household of familiar faces from home, most of whom were promptly sent back, because your new subjects wanted their queen surrounded by their people, not yours. You learned the language. You learned the customs. You learned which of your new husband's barons smiled at you, and which merely showed their teeth. You were a child, doing the hardest diplomatic posting in Europe, alone. Every queen you will ever meet started exactly this way. Remember that, the next time one of them frightens you. And you still haven't seen your own money, but we'll get to that, because you have rather a lot of it. Because here is a thing almost nobody knows about medieval queens. You are rich in your own right. Upon marriage you were granted your dower, lands, manors, whole towns in some cases, mills and forests and rents, assigned to you personally to fund your household and dignity. This is called the Queen's estate, and it makes you, on paper, one of the greatest landholders in the kingdom, which means you have tenants. You have stewards and bailiffs managing manors you have never seen. You have accounts, long, hypnotic parchment rolls of them, and lawsuits, because medieval landholding is approximately 40% lawsuits, and petitions from your towns, and repairs to your mills, and a treasurer who arrives at your chamber with the expression of a man carrying bad news about sheep. You are expected to understand all of it, and the striking thing is, queens did. Real medieval queens read their accounts, chased their debtors, appointed their officers, and ran their estates with a shrewdness that would impress any modern board of directors. The image of the passive princess in the tower is, you are discovering, mostly a later invention. The real queen in the tower was going through the tower's expense reports. And you still haven't packed? Yes, packed. Because we'll get to the single most exhausting fact of your new life right now. The court does not stay anywhere. That is the fact. The medieval court is not a place. It is a migration. A royal household of hundreds of people, with all its food, furniture, documents, chapel plate, tapestries, beds, hounds, hawks, and wine, so much wine, cannot sit in one castle for long, for the simple, unglamorous reason that it eats the surrounding countryside bare and fills every latrine in the district, and then it must move on, like a very well-dressed swarm of locusts. So the court rolls endlessly around the kingdom, from castle to palace to abbey to hunting lodge, and everything travels with it. Your entire bedroom, the bed, the hangings, the chests, the silver, is dismantled, loaded onto carts, hauled 20 miles through weather and mud, and reassembled by evening in a different castle, so that you can sleep, in theory, in the same bed every night in a different county. The royal baggage train could stretch for miles. Officers ride ahead to seize supplies and commandeer lodgings. The roads are bad, the rivers must be forded, the carts break, the rain does not care who you are. You, at least, ride a fine palfrey or travel in a covered horse-drawn litter, which sounds elegant and feels like being gently shaken in a large expensive box for 6 hours. By the time you arrive, smiling serenely at the town gathered to cheer you, you have mud to the knee under the silk. You will do this journey, or one like it, perhaps 100 times this year. And you still haven't inspected tonight's castle. Let's do that next, and brace yourself, because it's romantic right up until you get inside. From the road, the castle is everything the ballads promise: towers, banners, the long bright water of the moat. Inside, it is a masterpiece of magnificent inconvenience. The floors of the great chambers are strewn with rushes and sweet herbs, which sounds charming, and is, until you consider what falls into them: bones, spills, mud, the enthusiasm of dogs, and how long it stays there between changings. Fleas are not a possibility, they are a population. Smoke from the great hearths rises, mostly, toward the vents and louvres, and otherwise into everything you own, which is why your furs are stored with lavender, and your ladies smell faintly, permanently, of wood smoke, the signature perfume of the entire aristocracy. And then there is the garderobe, which is the polite name for the castle toilet, a small stone chamber built out from the wall, with a wooden seat over a shaft that drops, sheer and unapologetic, to the moat below. It is, in winter, the coldest place in the entire kingdom. Courtiers hang their robes in it, because the, let us say, atmosphere keeps the moss away. That is genuinely true, and genuinely how the garderobe got its name, from garter, to keep, and robe, robes. Your gown, your grace, is stored in the toilet. This is the glamour of royalty. Smile serenely. And you still haven't survived dinner, which is an event, a performance, and a minefield, and we'll get to it now. Dinner at court is not a meal. It is theater with food in it. It happens absurdly early by your standards, mid-morning to midday, in the great hall, under the banners, before the entire household and any guest, envoy, or hanger on the day has washed in. You sit at the high table, on the dais, under a canopy of estate, a cloth of honor that hangs over precisely those persons grand enough to sit beneath it, and precedence decides everything else. Who sits above the great silver salt cellar, and who below it, who is served first, who shares a dish with whom, who gets the best cuts, and who gets, in every sense, the leftovers. The food itself is a power display. Meats gilded with saffron and real gold leaf, swans and peacocks roasted and then redressed in their own feathers, sailing down the hall like ships, pies that open to release live birds, to the delight of everyone except the birds, and spice everywhere, pepper, ginger, cinnamon, cloves, hauled across half the world at ruinous cost precisely so that everyone can see, in every dish, exactly how far your husband's money reaches. You eat from trenchers with your fingers and a knife and a spoon. The fork is regarded, where it is known at all, as a suspicious foreign affectation, and you eat carefully, gracefully, because 150 people are watching her grace eat, and word of any queen's table manners travels, at diplomatic speed, across the whole of Europe. Musicians play from the gallery. A carver dismantles a swan before you with liturgical solemnity. It goes on for hours. Your stays ache, your smile aches, and somewhere down the hall 2 barons are quietly starting a feud over the seating. And you still haven't done the single most important part of your day's work, the petitions. We'll get to them, because this is where you earn the crown. Every day, wherever the court settles, they come, the petitioners. Widows whose land was seized. Merchants ruined by a corrupt official. Prisoners' wives. Abbots with grievances. Towns begging relief from taxes after a fire or a flood. They cannot reach the king. The king is busy, guarded, terrifying, but they can, by ancient custom, reach you. Because this is the heart of the queen's job, the real one, the one written into the coronation liturgy itself, intercession. The queen is the kingdom's official channel of mercy. The king must be iron, so you may be gentle. He cannot pardon without looking weak, but he can be persuaded by his wife, publicly, gracefully, without anyone losing face, and everyone understands the choreography. A condemned man's mother kneels to you in the courtyard, weeping. You raise her up. At supper, you kneel. You, a crowned queen, kneel before your husband and beg the man's life as a personal favor. The king, sternly, grants it, out of love for his dear queen. The court applauds his mercy and your goodness. Order is preserved. A man lives. It is theater, yes. It is also power, real power, the kind that fills your antechamber every morning with people who know the truth, that in this whole armored kingdom, the surest road to the king's heart passes through you. Use it wisely. Everyone is counting how often you do. And you still haven't touched your correspondence, which is a shame, because half of Europe is waiting on your reply. We'll get to it. The letters, then. In your chamber, in the good light of early afternoon, your clerk reads them out. From your mother, in the old country, wanting news and sending advice you did not request. From your brother the Duke, wanting you to soften your husband's line on a border dispute. Everyone always wants you to soften something. From an abbess you patronize, thanking you for the roof you paid for. From your steward in the north, regarding, inevitably, cheap. You dictate replies, and your words are weighed like coin, because a queen's letter is never just a letter. It is diplomacy, patronage, family, and politics braided into a single page and sealed, with your own seal, in your own name, an object of real legal power, pressed into hot wax under your own hand. Whole alliances have been steered by traffic like this, mothers writing to daughters queened across the sea, sisters knitting kingdoms together thread by thread beneath the notice of the chronicles. The men have the armies, but the letters, very often, have the women. It is slow, patient, invisible work, and you will do it every day of your life. And if you do it brilliantly, no one will ever thank you, because if you do it brilliantly, the wars you prevented will simply never happen. Such is the Queen's trade. Your victories are all invisible. Your mistakes, on the other hand, will be legendary. And you still haven't had a single moment of anything resembling fun today. Rest assured, the Middle Ages does have fun. We'll get to it next. The afternoon, if the saints are kind and no one is invading anything, belongs to the gentler arts. In the Queen's chambers, the ladies gather with their needlework, and let no one tell you embroidery is a small thing. The great embroidered hangings and vestments of this age are diplomatic gifts, church treasures, propaganda in silk and gold thread, and some of them will still be famous 8 centuries from now. You sew, and as you sew, someone reads aloud, "A saint's life if the chaplain is hovering," and something rather more exciting if he is not, because this is the great age of romance. Tales of Arthur and his knights, of Lancelot and Guinevere, of impossible love and terrible quests, composed, as it happens, for audiences of exactly this kind, for queens and their ladies, some of them commissioned by real queens you will meet before this night is over. There is music, always. A minstrel with a harp or a lute, singing in the long diocese about a knight who worships a distant, perfect, unnamed lady, and every lady in the room quietly deciding the song is about her. There are games, chess, at which medieval ladies were famously lethal, and dice, at which medieval everyone was famously lethal, and riddles and dancing, and a great deal of laughter of the particular kind that stops, instantly, when the door opens. It is the pleasantest part of the day. It is also, of course, work. Every romance chosen, every song permitted, every game lost graciously to the right person is a move on the board. You are never not on the board. And you still haven't been outside all day. Let's fix that, because the Queen is going hawking. Riding out is the great liberty of your life. On a fine afternoon the court spills into the open. Hounds, horses, huntsmen, ladies, and you ride at the heart of it, on a palfrey with a gilded saddle, a falcon on your gloved wrist. Hawking is the noble sport that women may fully, gloriously share, and you love it without any pretending. The jingle of the little bells on the birds' jesses, the loosing, the long climbing spiral, the stoop, that breath-stealing plummet out of the sun, and the strange proud intimacy of a wild creature that returns, again and again, to your own wrist. Your falcon is a status symbol, of course. In this world even the birds have rank, and the books of courtesy solemnly sort which bird belongs to which degree, an eagle for an emperor, a gerfalcon for a king, a peregrine for an earl, a merlin, they say, for a lady. Yours is the finest the kingdom can buy, a gift from your husband, worth more than the horse you ride on. Out here, with the wind pulling at your veil, and the hounds giving tongue somewhere along the river, the crown weighs almost nothing. For an hour, you are simply a young woman on a fast horse under a wide sky. Enjoy it completely. Because the ride home leads straight back to the single subject the entire kingdom discusses more than the weather, more than the harvest, more than the king himself. Your body. We'll get to it now, gently, because it is the true center of your whole royal existence. Here is the truth that sits under every silk gown you own. You have one duty that outweighs all the others combined, and it is to produce an heir. A son. Ideally, too, an heir and a spare, as later centuries will put it, because in a world of fevers and falls and wars, one son is a hope, not a guarantee. From the day of your wedding, the entire kingdom has been watching you the way farmers watch the sky. Ambassadors report on your health in cipher. Courtiers count months on their fingers. Every meal you refuse, every morning you look pale, sets the whole court whispering, hoping, calculating. And when it comes, when, by God's grace, you are with child, you become, overnight, the most precious and most supervised object in the realm. Physicians consult the stars and prescribe with confidence things that will one day make medical students wince. And as your time approaches, you withdraw, by solemn custom, into confinement, a chamber prepared like a jewel box, hung with tapestries, their subjects carefully chosen to be calm, nothing violent, nothing frightening, for fear it mark the child, the windows curtained, the light kept soft, the men banished utterly. For weeks, your world is this warm, dim, feminine room, your ladies, the midwives, prayer and waiting. And there is fear in the room too. We will not pretend otherwise. And every woman in it knows the stakes, and does not say them aloud. Childbirth is the battlefield of queens. You have girded for it with every weapon your age possesses. Relics borrowed from the great abbeys, the sash of a saint laid across your belly, prayers rising from every convent you have ever patronized. And when the cry finally comes, and the word runs down the stairways, and out through the gates and rides post horses to every corner of the realm, a son, the queen has a son, the bells of the whole kingdom will ring for you. You will hear them from your pillow, exhausted, triumphant, alive. There is no achievement in your world, no battle, no cathedral, no treaty, that matters more than what you just did. Rest now. Rest is, of course, temporary. We'll get to why. Because here is the strange sequel to that triumph. The child is not, in any daily sense, yours. A queen does not nurse her own baby. That is what wet nurses are for. Respectable women vetted like state officials, since everyone knows, or believes, that character passes through milk. The prince has his own household within weeks, his own nurses, rockers of the royal cradle, an actual salaried position, his own chamberlain in miniature, and, soon enough, his own castle, because heirs are too valuable to keep in one basket with the king. You will visit. You will get reports, like dispatches from a small, extremely important front. and before the child can properly talk, the marriage negotiations begin. Yes, already. His little name traded across the courts of Europe exactly as yours once was. If you are lucky and stubborn, you will carve out real time with your children, and some queens famously did, supervising their letters and their Latin, fighting like lionesses for their inheritances. But the tenderness of your world is always braided with statecraft, and one day you will stand in a courtyard watching a small figure with your eyes right away to be raised by strangers in a country you have never seen, a daughter, off to be queened in her turn, and you will wave, serenely, because the household is watching. And then you will go inside, and climb to your chamber, and your ladies will suddenly discover pressing reasons to be elsewhere, and the room, for once, will be private. The chronicles record none of these afternoons. There were thousands of them. And you still haven't dealt with the largest fact of your life, the one wearing the other crown. Your husband. We'll get to him now. The king. He is, legally and cosmically, your lord. You knelt to him on your wedding day, and the whole apparatus of your world, sermons, laws, table seating, proclaims him your head as Christ is head of the church. That is the theory. The practice, as every married soul in every century knows, is negotiated daily. Perhaps you are lucky. It happened. The age's own chronicles record kings who genuinely, extravagantly loved their wives, trusted them with kingdoms, built crosses across a whole country for a dead queen's funeral procession. Perhaps you are unlucky, and he is a fool, or a tyrant, or simply a stranger 20 years your senior who regards you, courteously, as a treaty with a pulse. Most likely, he is what most of them were, a busy, dangerous, burdened man, capable of kindness and capable of rage, who is at war somewhere roughly half of your marriage, and whom you must learn, because your children's inheritance and your own safety ride on it, to read like weather. And then there are the mistresses. There will, quite possibly, be mistresses. Kings considered it practically a perquisite of the crown, and the double standard of your age is a fortress. His adultery is a peccadillo. Yours would be treason, literal, capital treason, since it strikes at the succession itself. So you will smile at women at your own court whose position you understand precisely, and you will say nothing in public ever. What you say in private, and what it costs you, and what leverage you extract for your silence, that is your own affair, conducted in the only truly sovereign territory you possess, behind the bed curtains, in the last hour of the day, where kings, whatever the sermons claim, have been persuaded of a very great deal. Political historians will one day call this soft power. You call it Tuesday. And you still haven't met your real enemies. Not the foreign armies, the ones inside the walls. We'll get to them. Because the court, you must understand, contains multitudes, and a good third of them wish you ill on principle. You are foreign. That is charge number one, permanent and unanswerable. When you promote a countryman of your own, you are packing the court with foreigners. When you don't, you have coldly abandoned your friends. When you influence the king, you are a meddling woman ruling from the pillow. When you don't, you are useless. And why did we pay that dowry? Every faction at court, and the court is nothing but factions. Great families locked in feuds so old nobody remembers the first insult, read you as either an asset or an obstacle, and the ones who read you as an obstacle have a traditional weapon against queens, older than castles, rumor. It starts nowhere and lives everywhere. The queen is extravagant. Have you seen the accounts of her wardrobe? The queen favors her own countrymen. Look at her household list. The queen is barren, or worse, the whisper that has toppled real queens and will topple more. The child is not the king's. You cannot fight it with a sword, and your husband, infuriatingly, cannot fight it for you without dignifying it. Your armor is conduct, relentless, spotless, exhausting conduct. Piety no one can question, charity no one can mock, accounts no one can fault, a face that shows nothing it does not choose to show, worn every waking hour in front of an audience that never, ever goes home. One slip, one letter carelessly worded, one laugh with the wrong night at the wrong feast, and the whisper machine has fuel for a decade. You are the most watched woman in the kingdom, performing serenity on a stage with no wings to exit into. And you still haven't gotten through the feast tonight, where every one of those watchers will be seated in order of how dangerous they are. But before the feast, there are a few more rooms of your life you ought to see, starting with the one where a learned man in a long gown is waiting to look at you with deep professional concern. The queen has a physician. We'll get to him now, and do try not to be too healthy, it only disappoints him. Your physician is one of the most educated men in the kingdom, a university man, trained at Paris or Salerno or Bologna, and everything he believes about your body is magnificently, systematically wrong. Medicine in your world rests on the ancient theory of the four humors, blood, phlegm, and the two biles, yellow and black, whose balance within you determines your health, your moods, and much of your personality. Are you feeling melancholy? Too much black bile. The word melancholy literally means exactly that. Feverish? And excess of blood, which is why the universal remedy of your age is bleeding. The careful opening of a vein to drain off the surplus, performed on a schedule at the astrologically correct hour, because no respectable physician would dream of treating a queen without first consulting the stars. He examines your urine against a chart of subtle shades. He prescribes diets by humor. No melancholy foods for her grace, more warm and moist things, a little good wine. He recommends against too much bathing, which opens the pores to pestilence, though you, blessedly, ignore him on this point, as queens generally did, and take your scented baths in a great wooden tub lined with linen, like a civilized person. And alongside all of it, seamlessly, runs the other medicine, the relics. A saint's finger bone for fever. A pilgrim badge for the toothache. Holy water from a famous shrine. The girdle of a saint for childbirth. Prayers to Saint Margaret, who watches over laboring mothers. You take both kinds of medicine, the learned and the holy, without any sense of contradiction, because your whole world takes them, from the plowman to the pope. And to be fair to your physician, his herbs sometimes work, his bedside manner is superb, and his fees are heroic. Some things in medicine, at least, are eternal. And you still haven't opened your jewel chests today. We'll get to them, because they are not what you think they are. Your wardrobe and your jewels are not luxuries. They are a government department. Somewhere in this castle, under lock and guard, travel the chests. The crowns, there are several, for different grades of occasion, the coronets, the rings, the brooches, the girdles of gold, the reliquary pendants, the cloth of gold itself, folded in linen against the moth. Every piece is inventoried on parchment rolls by clerks, who count them in, and count them out like the treasury officers they effectively are, because that is what your jewels actually are. The kingdom's emergency reserve, wealth in its most portable form. Kings in a tight corner pawn their crowns. Real kings, repeatedly, sometimes to foreign bankers, once or twice to their own subjects, and a queen's jewel chest has financed more than one war. When you appear at the feast tonight wearing a fortune, you are not showing off. You are publishing the kingdom's credit rating, wearing the national debt ceiling on your actual head. And the wardrobe works the same way. Those furs and silks flow outward from you in a constant, calculated river of gifts, robes to reward a loyal knight, cloth to dress your ladies at the great feasts, liveries in your colors for the whole household twice a year, until half the court walks about wearing your generosity on its back. Giving is not kindness at your level, it is governance. A queen who gives well is beloved, which is to say obeyed. A queen who gives badly is stingy, which is to say friendless, which is to say finished. You will study gift-giving the way generals study ground. And you still haven't opened a book today. Yes, your grace, you own books, and they are worth more than most knights' estates. We'll get to your library right now. Your books live in a chest of their own, wrapped in silk, and there are perhaps a dozen of them, which makes yours one of the finest libraries in the kingdom, because every single book in your world is made by hand. A great illuminated volume is the work of years. The parchment alone is the skins of an entire flock, scraped and stretched and polished. The script is set down line by patient line by scribes who train for decades, and the illuminations, the tiny blazing pictures in the margins, the gold leaf burnished until it catches candlelight like treasure, the blues ground from actual lapis lazuli carried from mines at the far end of the world, cost, quite literally, more than their weight in silver. The heart of your collection is your psalter, your book of psalms and prayers, made for you, with your own portrait kneeling in gold on the dedication page, and the calendar of your family's saints' days at the front. You will read from it every day of your life, give thanks in it, weep into it privately on occasion, and leave it, in your will, to your daughter. Queen psalters pass down the generations like crowns, and some of them survive to this day, with 800 years of royal thumb marks worn soft into the margins. Around it gather the others, a book of hours, a saint's life or two, a chronicle of your husband's ancestors tactfully improved, a bestiary full of confident nonsense about elephants, and, kept slightly apart, the chaplain pretending hard not to see it, the romances. And here is what your books say about you that nothing else does. You can read. In a world where most kings historically signed with a cross, and many a great baron regarded literacy as a clerk's trick, the women of the aristocracy were very often the readers of the family. It was mothers, and their books, who taught the princes their letters, queens who commissioned the chronicles and the poems, ladies whose libraries seated what would one day grow into the great collections of Europe. The sword hand of civilization got the statues. The book hand, rather often, wore a veil. Remember that tonight when you hear that this was a man's world. It was, but somebody in it had to be able to read the treaties. And you still haven't been to a tournament, which is a pity, because it is the single most exciting thing your world does on purpose. We'll get to it right now. Tournament day is the medieval world at maximum volume, and you are, officially, its brightest ornament. The lists are built in a meadow below the castle, barriers and galleries, pennons snapping, the heralds bawling names and lineages, the crowd of thousands, lords, ladies, grooms, pie sellers, pickpockets, packed and buzzing under the banners. You preside from the high gallery, under your canopy, among your ladies, and understand, the entire spectacle is aimed at you. This is the age of chivalry, and the fiction, everyone knows it is a fiction, which changes nothing, is that every knight below fights for the honor of a lady above. They wear favors, a sleeve, a ribbon, a glove from some blushing girl in your gallery, tied to helm or lance. The champions dip their lances to the queen before they run. And then the charge, the drumming earth, the crack of lance on shield that you feel in your breastbone, the splinters wheeling up into the sunlight, a knight pitched clean over his horse's tail with a sound like a dropped kitchen, and the crowd roaring, and the herald shrieking the score. It is glorious, it is gorgeous, and it is genuinely dangerous. Men are hurt at tournaments. Kings have been hurt at tournaments, and the church bans them roughly once a generation, with no effect whatsoever, because the young men adore them, and, frankly, so does everyone else. You award the prizes at the day's end: a jeweled clasp, a fine falcon, a kiss on the cheek for the victor, who kneels, mud and all, grinning like a boy. It is the best show on earth, and tomorrow the court will talk of nothing else for a week. Neither, privately, will you. And you still haven't kept Christmas, and Christmas, your grace, is where your whole year has been heading. We'll get to it, because the medieval year is not a line, it is a wheel of feasts, and its glowing hub is the Christmas court. For the 12 days from Christmas to Epiphany, the whole realm's great world gathers wherever you and the king keep the season, the halls decked in holly, ivy, and bay, the great Yule log dragged in to burn through the nights, 1,000 candles doing their golden work against the longest darkness of the year. There is feasting on a scale that makes ordinary court dinners look like fasting, the boar's head borne into trumpets, wine spiced and steaming, subtleties from the kitchen shaped like castles and ships, and once, memorably, the archbishop. There is music and caroling, which in your century is dancing as much as singing, and games that turn the world deliberately, deliciously upside down. A Lord of Misrule crowned from among the servants to command absurdities, a boy bishop preaching in a mitre 3 sizes too big, the mighty waiting, laughing, on the humble, for one licensed season only. And there are the gifts, given at New Year, not Christmas, which for you are the year's grand strategic exchange, every magnate, envoy, and hopeful cleric presenting at the throne, every present weighed, recorded, and reciprocated to the precisely calibrated penny's worth of favor you intend. The wheel of the year has other spokes, Easter in its solemn glory, Whitsun when the court wears its new summer liveries, the long green revels of May, but it is midwinter, all the fires, and the fur, and the gold against the dark, that you will remember when you are old. Enjoy it, your grace. You have earned one season of unambiguous delight. But there is one more duty we have not yet watched, the quietest one, and the one the common people will remember you for longest. We'll get to it now, the giving. Because beneath all the gold, the queen is the kingdom's charity made visible, and this is not a metaphor. It is a budget line. Every day of the year, your almoner, a priest whose entire office is the distribution of your mercy, dispenses your alms, bread and coin at the gate to whoever gathers there, and whoever gathers there knows to gather, because the queen's giving is as reliable as the tides. The leftovers of every vast court dinner, and you have seen the scale of them, go by right to the poor at the door. On the great holy days you give in person. On Maundy Thursday, the day before Good Friday, you and the king kneel on the floor, in your finest clothes, and wash the feet of poor men and women, one for each year of your age, and clothe them, and feed them, and send them off with silver, because your Lord did the same, and because a kingdom watches what its anointed do on their knees. And when you travel, those endless migrations, your arrival in any town is an event of state called the royal entry, the gates hung with tapestries, the guilds turned out in their liveries, children costumed as angels on scaffolds along the route singing verses composed for you, wine, on the truly grand occasions, running in the public fountains, and the whole population packed along the streets to see the Queen ride through, because for nearly everyone watching, you are the closest thing to a legend they will ever see with their own eyes, and they will describe this day to their grandchildren. You will smile, and scatter coins, and accept a pageant in which someone's nephew, dressed as St. George, forgets his lines. And here is the secret at the middle of it. Of all your duties, this one is real. The petitions you steer, the mercy you beg from the king, the bread at the gate, strip away every ounce of the theater, and underneath there are still actual widows with actual bread. Queens clung to that, across the centuries, more than the chronicles ever noticed. On the bad days, and you have had a taste now of the bad days, it is the part of the job that lets you sleep. And now, the crown itself. The literal one. Because we should talk about the day they put it on you. Your coronation was the single greatest day of your life, and it is worth remembering on the hard days, because it changed what you are. In the great abbey, before every magnate in the realm, you were led to the altar in robes stiff with gold, and the archbishop anointed you with holy oil. Anointed, the same word, the same oil, or nearly, as the king himself, and set the crown on your head, and a scepter in your hand, while the choir thundered and the light came down through the tall windows like the approval of heaven. Understand what that means. You are not merely the king's wife. You are a consecrated person, a queen by the grace of God, prayed for by name in every church in the land. The coronation rite itself spells out your holy office to be a peacemaker, a protector of the church, a mother to the kingdom's poor, which is to say, even God, in this arrangement, has given you a job description. And on the great feasts of the year, the court performs it all again in miniature. The crown wearings, when you and the king sit enthroned side by side in state, crowned and robed and utterly motionless, while the whole realm files past to look at you. Hours. Motionless. In a metal hat. Children in the crowd gape. Ambassadors take notes. Your neck files a formal complaint. This, too, is the job, to be on demand, not a person but an image, the kingdom made visible, in a woman's shape, sitting very still. You are extremely good at sitting still by now. You have had a great deal of practice. And you still haven't heard the sound that every queen dreads and half expects, the messenger on the night road, riding too fast, with news of the king. Because sooner or later, the king rides to war. We'll get to what happens to you when he does. War is the king's season, and it comes as regularly as harvest. And when the king rides out, to a border rebellion, to a crusade, to one of the grinding continental campaigns that eat treasure and men by the decade, something remarkable happens to you. The kingdom, or a great piece of it, lands in your lap. It was utterly normal, and this surprises people 8 centuries later, for a departing king to name his queen regent, keeper of the seal, mistress of the councils, commander, on parchment at least, of everything he left behind. Real queens in your position raised taxes, appointed sheriffs, put down riots, negotiated with archbishops, and in more than one famous case took personal charge of the defense of the realm, while their husbands were away being heroic somewhere expensive. You govern with his council watching your every syllable, half of them convinced a woman cannot do this, all of them writing letters about you. And you do it anyway, competently, for months or years, and when the king comes home the chronicles will record that the land was kept in good peace, passive voice, no name, and the council will remember it as their own achievement. You will not even be surprised. But there is a darker version of the king's absence, and every queen knows it. The war lost, the king captured and held to ransom. It happened to the greatest of them, or the king dead, and your son a child, and the wolves of the court suddenly very attentive, very solicitous, circling the small boy who is now the kingdom, and the foreign woman who stands between them and him. Queens in that hour became lionesses, or became casualties, and sometimes both. Hold the thought. Before tonight is over, you will meet women who lived that exact hour, and what they did with it will keep you awake, pleasantly, I promise, for years. And you still haven't faced the last great question of a queen's life, the one waiting patiently at the end of all the others. What becomes of you when the crown changes heads? We'll get to it, and then, your grace, we will finally let you have your supper. Because every queen consort lives with an appointment she cannot cancel. One day, if you are not first to go, the king your husband will die, and within the hour you will be something new, the queen dowager, the old queen, the widow. Your income, at least, is armored. Those dour lands you have been managing so shrewdly all these years exist precisely for this day, and woe to the new regime that tries to touch them. For widows in your world went to law like knights went to tournaments, and frequently won. But your power now depends entirely on one relationship, the new king. If he is your son, and he loves you, you may enter the golden years of your whole existence. The king's honored mother, matriarch of the dynasty, consulted, deferred to, dangerous, free at last of a wife's obedience and armed with a lifetime of secrets. Some of the most formidable political operators of the entire Middle Ages were exactly this, dowager queens, sailing through their 60s and 70s with nothing left to fear and everything to arrange. If the new king is not your son, or worse, is your enemy's son, then the convent begins to be mentioned in your presence, gently, the way one mentions the weather. A dignified retirement, your grace, so restful, and such a convenient distance from everything. Many queens took it, and some genuinely gladly, trading the exhausting stage for a warm, ordered world of books and bells and gardens where, for the first time since childhood, nobody was watching. And a few, the ones the chronicles could never quite forgive or forget, refused every quiet ending offered to them, and rode on through widowhood like flagships, arranging marriages, financing wars, terrifying their grandchildren's councils, dying at last in harness at 80 with half of Europe related to them and all of it relieved. You already suspect which kind you would be. So do we. And now, at long last, supper. The evening, when it finally folds around you, is the gentlest hour of the queen's day. Supper is a smaller, softer meal than the great public dinner, nearer the fire, fewer watchers, the candles doing their slow warm work on the gold thread and the wine. Afterwards, in the queen's chambers, the inner circle only, a harper playing something old and sweet from your own country, the ladies at their quiet games, the fire settling, the talk loosening at last into something almost like ease. Then the long unmaking, the crown of the day set down, pin by pin, layer by layer, the jewels locked into their chests, the gown brushed and hung, ironically, in the garderobe, the braids unwound until your hair falls loose and you are, for a few minutes in the candlelight, nobody's image and nobody's treaty. Your ladies bank the fire, draw the great bed curtains around you, and settle onto their own beds by the door. And in the warm dark of the enclosed bed, the one truly private room you will ever own, you take the day's inventory, as you always do. You were dressed, blessed, watched, judged, petitioned, flattered, slandered, obeyed. You fed a court, steered a letter that may quietly prevent a war, begged one life from the king and got it, lost gracefully at chess to a countess who will remember it forever, and sat still, in a metal hat, while a kingdom looked at you. Tomorrow you will wake and do every bit of it again, and no one, not the chronicles, not the ballads, not even, most days, the king, will ever quite see how much holding up of the sky it took. This is the truth of the golden cage, the one every queen learns, and none of them wrote down. The bars are real, and the gold is real too, and living in it took more strength, more wit, and more sheer unglamorous stamina than most of the sword-swinging heroes history remembers instead. You wouldn't last a day. Honestly, you wouldn't last until the mid-morning dinner. But some women lasted lifetimes in it, and bit it, and now, and then broke it open from the inside. And it is time you met them. Sleep is coming, but the night is long, and I have 3 true stories to tell you. 3 real medieval queens, each of them once a girl handed to a stranger with a crown, each of them, in the end, more than the cage was built to hold. Let us begin with the greatest of them all. Long before she was the most famous queen of the entire Middle Ages, before she had worn the crowns of 2 rival kingdoms, ridden on crusade to the walls of Jerusalem, raised a rebellion against her own husband, survived 16 years as his prisoner, and outlived very nearly everyone who had ever crossed her, she was simply Eleanor, a girl of the warm South, growing up in the richest and most pleasure-loving court in Europe. Aquitaine, her homeland, was not really a part of France in any way that mattered. It was a vast, golden country of its own, sprawling across the whole southwest from the river Loire to the Pyrenees mountains, vineyards, olive light, rich cities, troubadour song, ruled by her family, the Dukes of Aquitaine, who were wealthier than the kings of France and behaved accordingly. Her grandfather, Duke William IX, was the first troubadour whose songs survive. A scandalous, brilliant, excommunicated twice charmer who wrote poetry that still blushes on the page 800 years later. That was the household Eleanor came from, a court where music, poetry, argument, and female intelligence were not merely tolerated but performed, loudly, before dinner. She was educated like a prince. Reading, Latin, music, hawking, horses, and the administration of the sprawling, unruly duchy she was never supposed to inherit. And then, in the way of the Middle Ages, the deaths began. Her only brother died as a child. And in the spring of her adolescence her father, Duke William X, set off on pilgrimage to Compostela and died on the road, on Good Friday, before the altar, asking with his last breath that the King of France protect his daughter. And just like that, a girl of perhaps 15 woke up as the greatest heiress in Europe, Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right, mistress of a third of modern France, and the single most valuable unmarried person alive. What followed happened at the speed of panic. An heiress like Eleanor could not remain unmarried for a season. She would be kidnapped by some enterprising baron within the month. That was simply how the age worked, and everyone knew it. So the dying duke's request became the old French king's opportunity, and within weeks, Eleanor was married to the king's own son and heir, the future Louis VII, a match that would staple her enormous, wealthy, sun-soaked duchy onto the modest royal lands of France. She was about 15, he was about 17. And within days of the wedding, before the celebrations were even properly digested, word came racing south. The old king was dead. The teenage newlyweds were suddenly king and queen of France. It is hard to imagine two young people less suited to each other. Louis was gentle, devout, and painfully earnest. He had been raised for the church, not the crown, until his elder brother died in a riding accident, and he never really stopped being a monk who had wandered into a throne room. He was also, by every account, besotted with his dazzling southern wife. Eleanor, clever, worldly, raised on troubadour wit and southern warmth, found herself queen of a court that regarded her as alarmingly foreign, too rich, too confident, too fond of music and fine clothes, too visibly amused. The northern churchmen frowned at her. She declined, magnificently, to wilt. One remark attributed to her would follow the marriage forever, that she had thought to marry a king, and found she had married a monk. She was not, however, decorative, and France learned it quickly. Eleanor involved herself in the kingdom's business with an assurance that scandalized Louis's advisers, championing her sister's dubious marriage, pushing the crown into a feud with the powerful house of Champagne, and steering her mild husband into a war that ended in genuine horror. At the town of Vitry, a church full of people burned during the fighting, and Louis, pious, tender-hearted Louis, never forgave himself. Half of Europe muttered that the young king was ruled by his wife, which was unfair in the details, and not entirely wrong in the general drift. And then came the great adventure that would make Eleanor a legend and very nearly unmade her: the Second Crusade. When the call came to march east and rescue the Crusader states, Louis took the cross, and Eleanor, Duchess of Aquitaine, took it too, in person, at his side, and announced she was coming along, with her vassals and a household of her ladies. A queen of France, riding to the Holy Land. The chroniclers never recovered. The march itself was a slow-motion catastrophe, across Europe, through Constantinople, into the murderous mountains of Anatolia, where the army was mauled and frozen and starved, and where, on one terrible pass, a decision involving the vanguard, commanded by one of Eleanor's own Aquitanian vassals, led to a massacre that the Whisperers, naturally, laid at the queen's door. By the time the battered remnant reached the Crusader city of Antioch, the royal marriage was traveling on its rims. And yet, it is the crusade, more than anything else, that built the Eleanor legend, because Europe simply could not stop talking about the fact that she had gone. Within a generation, the stories had begun to grow the way stories do, that the queen and her ladies had ridden out dressed as Amazons, gilt boots and white banners, Eleanor herself playing the warrior queen of the old epics at the head of a company of armed ladies. Sober historians will tell you, correctly, that no eyewitness saw any such thing. The tale surfaces later, embroidered by a Greek chronicler with a taste for classical flourishes, and sober historians are almost certainly right, and it has never mattered even slightly. The legend stuck because it felt true, because a queen of France really had taken the cross in her own person, really had ridden those impossible mountain roads with the army, really had seen Constantinople, a city beside which Paris was a village, and the court of the Greek emperor, and the ruins and relics of the East, while the kings of Europe's other wives stayed home embroidering. Every mile of it went into her. You do not spend 2 years crossing the known world at 25, watching empires operate and armies fail and great men improvise, and come home content to be a decoration. Antioch was waiting at the end of that education, and Antioch, in every sense, was where the lesson landed. Antioch was ruled by Eleanor's own uncle, Raymond, young, magnificent, golden, one of the most admired princes of the East, and genuinely delighted to see his niece. In the warm, sophisticated, southern-speaking court of Antioch, after months of frozen misery, Eleanor came alive again. She and Raymond talked strategy late and laughed easily, and Raymond urged the sensible military plan, strike the real enemy at Aleppo, while Louis insisted on trudging on to Jerusalem to fulfill his pilgrim's vow. Eleanor took her uncle's side, publicly, and when Louis refused, she detonated the crisis of the age. She declared that she would stay at Antioch, and, the words that rang across Christendom, that their marriage was no true marriage at all, for they were too closely related by blood. Consanguinity, the medieval nuclear option. Louis's response was blunt. His men took the Queen of France from Antioch by night, effectively under arrest, and the army marched on. The crusade failed utterly, dribbling away in an inept siege of Damascus. The scandal did not fail. All Europe now murmured about the Queen and Antioch, embroidering freely, as Europe always does. Whatever the truth of it, and no one will ever know, the marriage was dead where it stood. Even a personal reconciliation staged by the Pope himself, who literally blessed a bed for them and produced, in due course, a second daughter, could not save it. 2 daughters, no son, and a queen who had stopped pretending. In the spring of 1152, at Beaugency on the Loire, an obedient council of bishops annulled the marriage of Louis and Eleanor on grounds of consanguinity, the very argument she had thrown at Antioch, and Eleanor, 30 years old, twice crowned and newly unmarried, mounted her horse and rode south, hard, for her own country. She dodged, en route, at least 2 ambushes by young noblemen who planned to marry the duchy by capturing the duchess, one of them a 16-year-old who would later, in one of history's dry little jokes, become her son-in-law. She reached Poitiers intact. And then Eleanor of Aquitaine did the single most consequential thing any woman of her century did. She chose her own husband. 8 weeks, after the annulment, in a quiet ceremony that asked nobody's permission, Eleanor married Henry Plantagenet, Duke of Normandy and Count of Anjou, 19 years old to her 30, red-haired, volcanic, brilliant, and heir apparent, through his formidable mother, a lady you will meet very shortly, to the crown of England. She had traded a month for a thunderstorm, and she knew exactly what she was doing. Their combined lands, her Aquitaine atop his Normandy and Anjou, made a single dominion stretching from the Scottish borders ambitions to the Pyrenees, vastly larger than the poor king of France's own holdings. Louis, who had somehow not seen this coming, spluttered, summoned them, was ignored, went briefly to war about it, and lost. 2 years later Henry made good his inheritance, and Eleanor was crowned, for the second time in her life, a queen, this time of England. And now came the season of astonishing fertility that rewrote Europe. After 15 years and 2 daughters with Louis, Eleanor bore Henry 8 children in 13 years, 5 sons and 3 daughters, while simultaneously governing as regent during his endless absences, crossing the Channel in all weathers, issuing charters, and running the machinery of an empire that never sat still. The whisperers who had called her barren went very quiet. Her sons alone would have made her immortal, among them Richard, called the Lionheart, and John, yes, that John, of the Magna Carta, and through her daughters her blood ran into the royal houses of Castile, Sicily, and Saxony until, within a few generations, there was scarcely a throne in Europe without Eleanor of Aquitaine somewhere behind it. They would call her, much later, the grandmother of Europe. At the time, they mostly called her indispensable, and the record shows why. For the first 15 years of the reign, Eleanor was not an ornament of Henry's empire. She was one of its working engines. The empire had no capital. It was a road, endlessly ridden, and while Henry blazed from Scotland to the Pyrenees putting out fires, Eleanor governed behind him, regent in England, issuing writs and charters under her own name, presiding over the exchequer's business, hearing pleas, regent in Anjou, duchess in her own Aquitaine, where the lords, who would bow to no Norman king, would still, grudgingly, bow to the daughter of their old dukes. She crossed the Channel, that cold, dangerous, seasick channel, more than a dozen times, several of them heavily pregnant, which deserves a moment's silence from every modern traveler. She managed the marriages of her growing brood into half the courts of Europe, ran a court whose accounts still survive to prove her appetite for fine things entirely intact, and patronized poets who dedicated to her some of the founding works of European literature. It was, by any standard, one of the great political partnerships in history. Two superbly able people running the largest dominion in Western Europe between them, which is precisely why its ending curdled so badly. Partnerships of equals do not survive one partner deciding he no longer requires an equal. And then, gradually, the indispensability stopped mattering because Henry, as the years passed, needed her less and listened less, and filled his court with clerks and his private hours with a mistress he flaunted, and the marriage of the century curdled, slowly, into a cold war between the two most formidable people in Europe. Eleanor did what no one expected. She left. She removed herself to her own Poitiers, to her own duchy, and set up her own court, and for a few shining years that court became the most talked-about place in the Western world. Poitiers in Eleanor's years was the mothership of the culture we still call courtly love. Under Eleanor and her daughter Marie of Champagne, the court became a finishing school for the aristocratic young, a concert hall for the greatest troubadours alive, and a laboratory for a genuinely subversive idea dressed up as a game, that love was an art with rules, that the lady, not the lord, presided over its courts, and that a knight's worth was measured by service and devotion rather than by what he could seize. The famous stories of the courts of love, noble ladies solemnly hearing lovers' disputes and handing down judgments, may be part legend. The cultural revolution was real. The romances read aloud tonight in every castle in Europe, the whole enormous mythology of the worshipped lady, Lancelot himself, commissioned, as it happens, by Eleanor's own daughter, trace back to that glittering decade at Poitiers. But underneath the music, something harder was assembling. Eleanor's sons were growing up landless in title-only grandeur under a father who delegated nothing, and they were their parents' sons, which is to say ungovernable. In 1173 the eldest bolted to the court of France and raised the standard of revolt against Henry, and his brothers Richard and Geoffrey rode to join him, and behind them, unthinkably, stood their mother, the Queen of England, backing her sons in armed rebellion against her own husband and king. It remains one of the most extraordinary acts of the entire Middle Ages, and it very nearly worked. The rising spanned the whole empire. But Henry was Henry. He broke the rebellion, and as it collapsed, his men intercepted a rider on the roads of Poitou, dressed, says the tradition, in man's clothes, spurring for the safety of France. It was Eleanor. Her husband had her taken to England, and there, without trial, without title of prisoner, without any process but a husband's will, the Duchess of Aquitaine and Queen of England was quietly shut away. She was 51. She would be confined, in one keep or another, for the next 16 years. 16 years. Her captivity was velvet, chambers, servants, an allowance, Christmases at court under supervision when Henry wanted to display family unity. But it was captivity, decade after decade, while the world she had built ran on without her, her sons feuding with their father and each other like a dynasty of stormfronts, her Poitiers court scattered, her name fading from the charters. Henry paraded his mistress, pressured her, the reports say, toward a convenient retirement as an abbess, which would have freed Aquitaine for his own disposal. She declined. She always declined. She endured the deaths, from her confinement, of 2 of her sons, including the eldest, who begged with his last breath for his mother's release and was refused. What she thought, across those 16 years of tapestried silence, no chronicle records, Queen's interiors were not considered newsworthy. But we know how the story turned, because in July 1189 Henry II, broken at last by one rebellion too many, this one led by Richard, with John's betrayal arriving as the final blow, died at Chinon, and one of the new King Richard's very first commands, sent galloping to England ahead of him, was, "Free my mother." And here the story becomes almost implausible. Eleanor of Aquitaine walked out of 16 years of confinement aged 65, an age at which her century expected a woman to be, at most, a memory, and simply resume command. She rode across England before Richard even arrived, holding courts, swearing men to the new king, emptying the prisons of Henry's petty victims with the remark, one chronicler says, that she knew from experience how sweet a thing release was to a prisoner. She organized the coronation. She governed, in practice, as Richard prepared his crusade. She was just getting started. The last 15 years of Eleanor's life are the part biographers reach for adjectives about, because no one, no king, no pope, no legend, did what this woman did in her 70s. When Richard went on crusade, she ran his kingdom's political defenses against the plotting of her own youngest son, John, and the King of France. When Richard needed a bride, Eleanor, near 70, personally crossed the Alps in winter, collected the Princess Berengaria in Navarre, and delivered her across the Mediterranean to Sicily. When Richard, returning from crusade, was seized and held to a king's ransom by the Holy Roman Emperor, it was Eleanor who squeezed the staggering sum out of England, a quarter of every man's income. Church plate melted. The old queen's letters to the Pope from this period survive, and they scorched the parchment, and Eleanor, in her 70s, who sailed to Germany in person to count out the silver and bring her son home. When Richard died, a crossbow bolt at an insignificant siege, in her arms, says the tradition, for she rode through the night to reach him, she swallowed the grief of her favorite and moved instantly to secure the succession for John against a rival claimant, her own grandson. And at 77 or so, to seal a peace, she made one last unbelievable journey, over the Pyrenees, in winter, to the court of Castile, to choose among her granddaughters the girl who would marry the heir of France. She picked the younger one, Blanca, judging her the stronger material, and history vindicated her totally. That girl became Blanche of Castile, Iron Regent of France and mother of a sainted king. Coming home across the mountains, in her late 70s, Eleanor was ambushed and briefly taken prisoner by an ungrateful vassal, negotiated her own release, and continued the journey. 2 years later, past 80, besieged in the castle of Mirbeau by an army led by her own grandson, she stalled him with negotiations until John's forces arrived in a lightning march and took the entire rebel leadership prisoner. The old lioness had won her last battle, from inside the trap, at 80. Her last home was the place she had loved longest, Fontevraud, the great abbey by the Loire, and it tells you everything about Eleanor that of all the religious houses in Christendom, she chose this one, because Fontevraud was that rarest of medieval institutions, a double monastery of monks and nuns ruled, by its founder's own design, by a woman. The abbess of Fontevraud commanded, the men obeyed. Eleanor had been showering it with gifts and charters for half a century, and in her final years she made it her court in miniature, ordering the tombs, arranging the effigies of her husband and her son Richard, she who had buried the one as an enemy and the other as her heart, and setting beside them, in due course, her own. She lived long enough to see almost everything she had built begin to tilt. John losing Normandy to the French king's grandson of her first husband, the great cross-channel empire she had stitched together with her own marriage beginning its long unraveling. If it grieved her, she left no word. She had never been one for leaving her grief where historians could find it. She died in 1204, at the Abbey of Fontevraud, where she had at last taken the veil, on her own schedule, in her own time, as she had done every single thing in her life. She had been Queen of France and Queen of England. She had seen Constantinople and Jerusalem. She had ruled, rebelled, been imprisoned, been freed, and buried a husband and most of her children. 10 kings and queens called her mother or grandmother. The nuns of Fontevraud, who knew her at the end, wrote that she was a queen who surpassed almost all the queens of the world. Her tomb is still there, and it is worth pausing tonight on what she chose for it. Her effigy lies not with sword or scepter, but holding an open book, reading, for eternity, entirely at her ease. 800 years later, no one has ever quite decided what Eleanor of Aquitaine was, scandal or saint, schemer or stateswoman, and one suspects she would find the indecision satisfactory. She had been handed at 15 to a stranger with a crown, like every girl in her position. Unlike nearly every girl in her position, by the time she was done, it was the crowns that belonged to her story, and not the other way around. Rest her book gently, and let her sleep. There are 2 more queens waiting for you tonight, and the next one never even got the crown she was promised, which is precisely what makes her unforgettable. Long before she was the woman who came within a single afternoon of being crowned the first ruling queen in English history, and long before she was the mother-in-law who handed Eleanor of Aquitaine her second crown, she was simply Matilda, a small, solemn, red-haired girl of 8, standing on the deck of a ship, watching England disappear behind her. Her father was King Henry I of England, son of William the Conqueror, a hard, brilliant, calculating king with a legendarily effective memory for injuries. And in the great market of royal children, his little daughter had fetched the highest price in Europe. She was to marry the Holy Roman Emperor himself, Henry V, Lord of Germany and Italy, the most exalted monarch in Western Christendom. She was 8 years old when they sent her to him. Her betrothed was in his 20s. She would not see England again for more than a decade and a half. In Germany they took away her English attendants, the standard procedure you already know from your own first day, designed to reforge a foreign child into a German empress, and they set about her education with imperial thoroughness, languages, letters, law, ceremony. At 12, she was married and crowned. While other children were learning their psalters, Matilda was learning to preside, over courts, over councils, over the tangled, dangerous politics of an empire perpetually at war with its own popes. And here is the remarkable thing, the thing that set the course of her whole life. She was good at it. Her young husband, busy, embattled, often absent over the Alps, trusted her with real work. She sponsored petitions, sat in judgment, and in her teens acted as his regent in Italy, ruling in the imperial name. The little English girl had become Matilda the Empress, and the title sank into her bones. For the rest of her life, through everything you are about to hear, she would sign herself Empress, always, first and above all. It was not vanity. It was the simple truth about her. She had been trained, from the age of 8, to rule, and by the one thing her age could never forgive, she had been trained to rule while female. And the German years gave her one more thing. They gave her Rome. When her husband marched over the Alps to settle his great quarrel with the Pope, the teenage Matilda rode with him, down the ancient passes, into Italy, into the marbled chaos of the eternal city itself, and there, in St. Peter's, the imperial crown ceremonies were performed over her, the highest honors the Western world could set on a woman's head. She had crossed the Alps before she was old enough, by our reckoning, to cross a street alone. She held courts in Italian palaces. Great lords knelt to a girl still growing out of her shoes, and she learned, this was the permanent lesson, to receive it without blinking, to let majesty settle over her like a second skin. The Germans, who had received a small foreign hostage bride, came to genuinely love her. Long after she left, their chroniclers remembered her simply as the good Matilda, and for years afterwards it was said that men in Germany told tales of their English empress. Keep that in mind, because in the second half of her story you will hear her called proud, haughty, intolerably high, and you may fairly ask, what else, precisely, had the entire adult world trained her to be since the age of 8? You do not raise a girl as an empress, and then complain that she carries herself like one. Then, as it always does in these stories, death rearranged everything. When Matilda was 23, her husband the emperor died, leaving her a childless dowager in a Germany that would elect a new emperor from elsewhere. She might have stayed. She held lands. She was respected. There was talk of German remarriages. But a catastrophe across the sea had already reached out for her. 5 years earlier, on a November night in 1120, a vessel called the White Ship, the finest in the Channel, carrying the flower of the young Anglo-Norman nobility home from France, most of them gloriously drunk, had struck a rock outside the harbor and gone down in the cold dark, and with it drowned William, her brother, the only legitimate son of King Henry I. It is said the king, when they finally dared tell him, fell to the ground, and that he never smiled again, the kind of detail chroniclers invent, except that this time no one has ever doubted it. The succession of England had drowned in an hour of drunken navigation. The aging king remarried at speed, but no new son came, and so his eye turned, with the cold clarity that was his gift, to his remaining legitimate child, the widowed empress. He summoned Matilda home, named her his heir, and then, because he knew exactly what his barons were, he made every magnate in England and Normandy, twice over in great public ceremonies, swear a solemn oath on holy relics to accept his daughter as their sovereign lady after his death. Among the very first to kneel and swear, with every appearance of devotion, was the king's charming, popular, well-fed nephew, a man named Stephen. Remember him? Matilda certainly did. Her father then did the thing that fathers in this story always do. He traded her again. For the security of Normandy's southern border, the Empress, 25, proud as Scripture, widow of the most exalted throne in Christendom, was married off to Geoffrey of Anjou, the teenage son of a mere count. He was about 14. She was furious, and made no secret of it. The marriage began as a diplomatic transaction between two people who could barely stand each other, separated once in its first years, and never warmed much beyond armed partnership. But Geoffrey, handsome, capable, nicknamed Plantagenet for the sprig of broom he wore in his hat, a nickname with a future, held up his end of the bargain in the way that mattered. 3 sons in quick succession, the eldest a red-haired boy called Henry. The dynasty had its next generation. And then, in December 1135, the old king died in Normandy, of, tradition insists, a surfeit of lampreys, eaten against his doctor's explicit orders, which is somehow the most believable detail in the entire century, and the oaths came due. And the oaths, it turned out, were worth exactly nothing. While Matilda, pregnant and far to the south, moved to secure Normandy's border fortresses, her cousin Stephen moved faster. He took ship for England, rode for London, charmed the city, charmed the treasury's keepers, produced a convenient witness who swore the old king had changed his mind at the end, and within 3 weeks of his uncle's death was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey, by an archbishop who had personally sworn on relics to uphold Matilda's right. Christendom shrugged. A woman on a throne? The barons had sworn, yes, but surely no one had expected them to mean it. Matilda was in Anjou with her babies, disinherited by a handshake and a sprint. She was not, however, her father's daughter for nothing. She did not write letters of protest. She went to war, a war that would consume England for nearly 20 years, a war so terrible that the chronicles gave it a name that still shivers, the Anarchy. It was said of those years that Christ and his saints slept. It took her 4 years to land in England, for years of building alliances, pressing her claim before the Pope, and watching Stephen fumble the kingdom he had snatched, alienating baron after baron, with a fatal blend of affability and bad judgment. When Matilda finally crossed in 1139, she came with her greatest asset, her half-brother Robert, Earl of Gloucester, the old king's illegitimate son, the best soldier in England, and a man of a loyalty so rare in this story it glows. England split like a dropped plate, the west for the Empress, the east for Stephen, and in between a landscape of burned harvests and improvised castles from which local strongmen robbed everyone impartially. For 2 years, the war ground on without a decision. And then, on a February morning in 1141, outside the walls of Lincoln, Stephen's army broke and ran, and Stephen himself, fighting on foot with genuine, useless courage, swinging first a sword and then, when it shattered, a borrowed axe, was beaten down and taken alive. The impossible had happened. The king was a prisoner. Matilda held him, in chains, at Bristol. The road to Westminster lay open, and the great men of England began arriving at the Empress's court with the smooth, unembarrassed speed of men who had always, deep down, supported her. A church council declared her Lady of the English, the sovereign in waiting. The royal treasury's keepers handed over what was left. London opened its gates to prepare the coronation. Matilda had done it. The little girl shipped to Germany, the widow recalled and retraded, the heiress disinherited in 3 weeks. She stood now, at 39, one ceremony away from being the first woman ever crowned ruler of England in her own right. One ceremony. History was holding its breath. And then history exhaled. But before we watch it exhale, meet the person who actually blew the candle out, because it was not a baron, and it was not an army. It was another queen, and in the middle of Matilda's story, she deserves her page. Stephen had a wife, Matilda of Boulogne. Yes, another Matilda. The 12th century had approximately 4 names and shared them ruthlessly. A small, pious, unremarkable seeming countess whom absolutely nobody had been watching. And when her husband was taken at Lincoln and every sensible man in England hurried to make his peace with the Empress, this other Matilda declined to be sensible. She hired mercenaries from her own lands across the sea. She held Kent. She marched an army to the very outskirts of London while the Empress prepared her coronation inside it, and she worked on the city, which loved Stephen, and its privileges, and its trade with her Boulogne, with promises and pressure and a wife's unanswerable public grief. When London rose and the Empress fled that laid table, it was this woman's campaign that had lit the fuse. And when the Empress's army was smashed at Winchester soon after, the army that smashed it was fighting under the Queen's command. One prisoner king exchanged for one captured earl, and the whole war reset, engineered, from start to finish, by a woman the chronicles barely bother to describe. Here is the joke the 12th century played on itself, and it is worth savoring in the dark. The age that swore no woman could wage war or hold a kingdom watched 2 women named Matilda do exactly those things, against each other, for the better part of a year, and then wrote down that women were not suited to rule, and went to bed satisfied. History exhaled. The Empress's crown dissolved, and the war rolled on toward its strangest night. What went wrong in London that summer is still argued about, 8 centuries on. The chronicles, written, every last one of them, by men, most of them Stephen's partisans, tell us the Empress became insufferable the moment power touched her, haughty, harsh, deaf to counsel, demanding money from a scorched city with none to give, refusing petitions with a scowl where a smile would have bought a kingdom. Perhaps some of it is even true. She was proud. She had been an empress since 12, and graciousness under insolence was never her gift. But notice, as she could not fail to notice, the shape of the trap. Every quality her age called kingly in a man, firmness, decisiveness, and unbending will, became, the instant it appeared in her, arrogance. A queen regnant was a creature the century had no category for, and so it filed her under monstrous. Whatever the true mixture of her pride and their panic, the result was history. As the coronation feast was being prepared, the bells of London rang backwards, the citizens rose like a swarm, and the Empress and her court, mid-meal says the tradition, fled the city at a gallop, leaving the tables laid. She was never crowned. Not that summer, not ever. And the years will kept turning against her. Her cause's iron general, Robert of Gloucester, was captured in a rout at Winchester that autumn while commanding the rearguard of her own desperate escape. She rode out of that disaster, they say, astride like a man, at the head of what remained. And with each side now holding the other's champion, the exchange became inevitable. Stephen for Robert, king for earl, and the whole war reset to the beginning, except bloodier, wearier, and with no end anywhere in sight. And then came the night that turned Matilda from a claimant into a legend. December 1142, the Empress, cornered at last, besieged in Oxford Castle for 3 months. Stephen's army camped in the snow outside the walls, food running out, no relief coming, and the garrison surrender, with the Empress inside, a matter of days. Capture would end everything, the cause, the claim, quite possibly, in some quiet dungeon, the life. So, on a black midwinter night, with the river Thames frozen hard beneath the walls, and snow falling thick enough to swallow the world, for figures slipped out of the castle. The tradition says down knotted ropes from a tower, through a postern gate, past the siege lines, dressed head to foot in white. White cloaks against white snow, walking on foot, in silence, straight through the middle of a besieging army, past the campfires, past the sentries whose calls and trumpets they could hear through the snowfall, across the frozen river, 6 miles through the drifts to safety. It worked. It is one of the great escapes in all of recorded history, and it was led by a 40-year-old empress who had been raised to preside over courts, not to hike frozen rivers in the dark. Oxford surrendered the next day, and Stephen, finding the prize gone, could only marvel with everyone else. She had escaped disguised, effectively, as the snow itself. Even the chroniclers who loathed her could not help themselves. You can feel them, on the page, beginning to admire her against their will. The war, however, would not be won by miracles. It settled into a decade of exhausted stalemate, Matilda unable to win the crown, Stephen unable to kill the claim, while the land, in the chronicler's unforgettable phrase, endured 19 long winters when God and his angels slept. Those years of stalemate deserve one story more, because they show you the texture of her life better than any battle. Her headquarters in those years was the castle of Devizes in the West Country, and the tradition says she had arrived in the region, in the darkest stretch of the war, by being smuggled through hostile territory bound to a funeral bier, wrapped like a corpse in grave clothes, carried solemnly past enemies who bared their heads for the passing dead. First the snow, then the shroud. The Empress escaped her enemies twice by pretending, essentially, not to exist, which was, when you think about it, exactly what her whole age kept demanding of her. From Devizes she ran her half of the kingdom, like the working ruler she had been trained to be, minting coins, granting charters, holding courts, rewarding the loyal from a treasury that was mostly promises. And she absorbed the 2 blows that would have ended the war for anyone else. Her rock, her general, her incomparable half-brother Robert of Gloucester, died quietly in the autumn of 1147, not in battle, after surviving 100 of them, but of a fever, and with him went the sword arm of her entire cause. And that same year, in a plot twist no romancer would dare invent, her 14-year-old son Henry appeared in England uninvited, with a tiny band of hired soldiers and a boy's conviction that he would finish his mother's war personally. The expedition promptly ran out of money. The mercenaries wanted paying, and the boy, with the family's magnificent nerve, applied for funds to the one man in England certain to have them, King Stephen. And Stephen, who was everything Matilda's cause said he was, usurper and oath-breaker, but who was also, hopelessly, a kind man, paid his rival's son's way home. Everyone in the story understood what it meant, even if no one said it aloud. The older generation was tired, and the future had just introduced himself. And slowly, the Empress made the shrewdest decision of her career. She stopped being the claimant. Because back in Anjou, that red-haired boy was growing up very fast indeed. Matilda's endgame was, in its way, more impressive than any coronation. In 1148, she withdrew to Normandy, which her husband Geoffrey had, methodically, conquered in her name while England burned, and she rebranded the entire war, no longer the Empress's claim, but her son's inheritance. Young Henry Fitz-Empress, Henry, son of the Empress, even his name was her argument, came at England again and again through his teens, and where his mother had commanded resentment, the boy commanded hope. and the story you already know now clicks into place like a key. In 1152, this same Henry, 19 years old, married a certain recently an old Duchess of Aquitaine, 11 years his senior, Eleanor herself, and the combined weight of their lands made the outcome merely a matter of arithmetic. When Stephen's own son and heir died suddenly, the exhausted king gave up. By treaty, Stephen would keep the crown until his death, and then it would pass, not to his line, but to Matilda's son. Stephen died within the year. And in December 1154, Henry II was crowned King of England, with Eleanor beside him, and the Empress's 20-year war was won, one generation deferred. Matilda never returned to England. She spent her last years outside Rouen in Normandy, and they were, by every account, her finest. The failed claimant matured into the indispensable elder stateswoman, regent of Normandy in her son's endless absences, patron of abbeys and hospitals, and a bridge across the Seine, and the one adviser the hot-headed young king actually feared disappointing. Her counsel was blunt and superb. It is recorded that she warned Henry, urgently, against appointing his charming friend Thomas Becket to Canterbury, advice he ignored, to his lifelong and famous regret, which rather settles the question of whose judgment was better. She died in 1167, in her 65th year, and was buried, as she wished, in the Abbey of Bec, wrapped, the story goes, in her old imperial mantle. The epitaph they carved for her may be the most double-edged compliment in all of medieval history, and it deserves to be heard whole. Great by birth, greater by marriage, greatest in her offspring, here lies Matilda, the daughter, wife, and mother of Henry. 3 Henrys, father, husband, son, and by the reckoning of her age, they were the measure of her. Her age, as usual, was wrong. She had held a claim through 19 years of civil war that would have broken most kings. She had walked out of a doomed castle through an enemy army in the snow, and every English monarch from that day to this, every single one, descends from her, not from Stephen. The first ruling queen of England is usually said to have come 4 centuries later. The first woman who fought a lifetime for the precedent, and paid its whole terrible price in advance, lies at rest in Normandy, in her empress's mantle, needing no crown to explain herself. Let her sleep. One queen remains tonight, and where Matilda was denied her throne by others, the last of our 3 took a throne, with an army, from her own husband. They called her the she-wolf. Decide for yourself, when you've heard her, whether they were right. Long before anyone called her the she-wolf of France, long before she raised an army against her own husband and pulled off the only successful invasion of England in the last 1,000 years that history barely remembers to count, she was simply Isabella, the adored youngest daughter of the most coldly magnificent king in Europe. Her father was Philip IV of France, called Philip the Fair for his looks and very little else about his character. A handsome, glacial, terrifying monarch who broke popes and toppled the Knights Templar. Isabella grew up in Paris, the true capital of the age, the largest, most brilliant city in Western Christendom, surrounded by power exercised at the highest level and by the unshakable conviction, drummed into every Cape Town child, that the royal blood of France was the finest substance in the created universe. She was clever, literate, strikingly beautiful by the united testimony of chroniclers who agreed on nothing else, and, in the family tradition, observant far beyond her years. And she was, of course, a treaty waiting to happen. England and France had been quarreling for a generation over the English king's lands in Gascony. 2 kings, and a pope stitched together the piece, and Isabella was the thread. She was betrothed as a small child, and in January 1308, in Boulogne, dressed in blue and gold with a crown of jewels, she was married to Edward II, the new young king of England. He was 23, tall, fair, athletic, magnificent to look at, the handsomest king in Europe, people said, to match the loveliest princess. She was 12 years old. And the trouble, which would one day reshape two kingdoms, started before the wedding wine was unpacked. The trouble had a name, Piers Gaveston. He was a Gascon knight's son, witty, gorgeous, athletic, and lethally amusing, and Edward loved him. Chroniclers reached for the story of David and Jonathan, and modern historians still debate the precise nature of the bond, but no one, then or now, has ever doubted its intensity. Edward had already recalled Gaveston from exile, and made him Earl of Cornwall, a title normally reserved for royalty, before sailing to his own wedding. What happened next became diplomatic legend. At the coronation feast in Westminster, Gaveston appeared dressed in royal purple sewn with pearls, outshining the king himself. The tapestries, guests noted with disbelief, bore the arms of Edward and Gaveston, not Edward and Isabella, and Edward preferred the couch of Gaveston, ignoring his 12-year-old queen so completely that her uncles walked out and reported home in fury. Worse, and this is the detail that every account of Isabella's life reaches for, because it explains so much of what came later. Edward took the wedding gift sent by the bride's father, the jewels of the King of France, and gave them to Gaveston. The picture wants care, because she was a child and the marriage was, by the age's own standards, in its formalities only phase. But the humiliation was public, systematic, and international, and Isabella, her father's daughter to the marrow, filed every detail of it away in the Capetian memory, which forgot nothing, ever. The barons of England, meanwhile, were compiling their own file. They loathed Gaveston for his influence, his arrogance, and above all his gift for lethal nicknames. He called the Earl of Warwick the Black Dog of Arden, and the Black Dog did not laugh. Twice they forced him into exile. Twice Edward brought him back. The third time, in 1312, a party of earls took him, and the Black Dog had his day, and Gaveston was killed on a hillside, leaving a king incandescent with grief and a court split down the middle. Isabella was 16. Her marriage's first rival was gone, and for a while, this is the part the she-wolf legend skips, things actually worked. It helps to see what those first years had actually been like for her, because the girl who endured them built the woman who ended them. Her English coronation itself had been a portent, Westminster so mismanaged, by Gaveston, who had appointed himself master of ceremonies and dressed accordingly, that the crowd surged, a wall collapsed behind the high altar, and a knight was killed in the crush. The banquet was served late and badly, and the French guests went home composing complaints. Her allowance, in the early months, was so meager that the 12-year-old Queen of England was writing home about her poverty, while her husband's friend wore her jewels. She grew up anyway, and fast, in the only direction available, inward and downward, into the machinery. She learned English ways and English factions. She built a household staffed with people loyal to her personally. She acquired, book by book, the library of romances she would collect all her life, and she gave alms with a steadiness the account rolls still witness. Isabella was, her whole life, spontaneously generous to the poor, to messengers, to anyone who did her a small kindness, a trait the she-wolf legend has never known what to do with. and she learned exactly what her husband's protection was worth on the night in her early marriage when a Scottish raid nearly caught the royal party at Tynemouth, and the king's departure by sea, with his favorite, left the queen to make her own escape, an abandonment that would be repeated, at the same place, years later, and that she reportedly never forgave. Then, in November 1312, 5 months after Gaveston's death, in the fortress of Windsor, the 16-year-old queen did the one thing no favorite could do and no faction could argue with. She gave England a healthy male heir. The kingdom went up in bonfires. Edward, whatever his griefs, was won over entirely. The couple appeared everywhere together. France glittered with pride. The girl who had been a footnote at her own coronation was suddenly the golden hinge of 2 kingdoms, and for a decade she made the position sing. Because here is the surprise at the middle of Isabella's story. For a decade she was a model queen, perhaps the best in Europe, and she and Edward were, by every visible measure, partners. She grew from a slighted child bride into a formidable political operator. The household books show them traveling together, dining together, exchanging gifts. For children arrived, first among them a healthy son, the future Edward III, and the succession glowed with health. And Isabella worked. She interceded. That queenly office you performed this morning, so constantly and so effectively that petitioners addressed themselves to her almost as a department of state. She managed her enormous estates with Capetian rigor, and above all, she became the indispensable diplomatic hinge between her husband and her father's France, crossing the Channel repeatedly to smooth crises that armies could not. When Edward's disastrous Scottish war collapsed at Bannockburn, she stood by him publicly. When she traveled to Paris, she performed a service for her father that became continental legend. Observing that the silk purses she had given her sisters-in-law had somehow migrated to the belts of 2 young knights, she reported the observation, and the resulting scandal of the Tour de Nesle shook the French royal family to its foundations, sent the knights to terrible ends and 2 princesses to prison, and announced to every court in Europe that the Queen of England's pretty eyes missed absolutely nothing. Remember that talent. It has a future. Even the disasters of these years, a near capture by Scottish raiders that she never forgave, the horrors of the Great Famine, she weathered at her husband's side. Had Edward II possessed even average judgment and friends, history would remember Isabella of France as one of the great consort queens, a builder of bridges between crowns. He did not possess it. Into the space Gaveston had left, a new favorite was rising, and this one was not a charming jester. This one was a predator. His name was Hugh Despenser the Younger, and where Gaveston had wanted glitter, Despenser wanted everything. Son of the king's loyal old counselor, he attached himself to Edward in the years after Bannockburn and grew, with terrifying speed, into the true ruler of England, chamberlain, gatekeeper. No one reached the king except through him, an architect of a naked kleptocracy, extorting lands and castles across Wales, and the march with the king's smiling connivance, imprisoning widows, breaking rivals, until the barons rose in fury, forced his exile, and were then crushed at Barbridge in 1322. When Edward, for once in his life, won a war. What followed the victory shocked even a hard age. Executions of noblemen by the dozen, the king's own cousin beheaded, estates confiscated wholesale. England had not seen anything like it in living memory, and the Despensers gorged on the spoils. And for Isabella, the world went dark with a strange precision. Despenser, unlike Gaveston, treated the queen not as an inconvenience but as a target, Her lands were confiscated on the pretext of war with France, her household purged, her French servants arrested, her children, this above all, removed from her keeping and placed with Despenser's own wife. The Queen of England found herself, by inches, a pensioner in her own court, watched, clipped, humiliated not with pearls and tapestries this time, but with the cold machinery of the state she had served for 15 years. She endured it, outwardly serene, from this morning, exactly what that serenity costs, and she waited, with the patience of a woman whose family motto might as well have been that revenge is a dish best served with paperwork. And in 1325, the paperwork arrived. A crisis over Gascony required a negotiator in Paris, someone royal, trusted, fluent, and acceptable to the new French king, who happened to be Isabella's brother. Despenser could not go. He was under sentence of death in France. Edward would not go. He dared not leave Despenser. And so, with the smooth inevitability of a trap closing, the court's most underestimated asset was selected for the mission. Isabella sailed for France in March 1325, with a small suite, a modest allowance, and the sweetest diplomatic brief of the century: negotiate with your own brother. She was 29. She never came back, not, at least, as a suppliant. In Paris, Isabella negotiated the treaty briskly, and then produced its masterstroke. The settlement required the King of England to come and pay homage for Gascony, or, alternatively, to send his heir. Edward, chained to Despenser by fears we can only guess at, chose the alternative. In September 1325, the 12-year-old Prince Edward crossed the sea to his mother, and the moment the boy knelt before the French king, Isabella held the one card that outranked every card in England, the heir to the throne, out of Despenser's reach. Then she stopped pretending. Summoned home, she delivered, before the French court, one of the most famous declarations of the entire Middle Ages, that someone had come between her husband and herself, and that, until this intruder was removed, she would wear the robes of a widow. Marriage, she said, was a joining of man and wife, and someone had broken the bond. It was magnificent, it was unanswerable, and it was a declaration of war wearing mourning dress. Around her in Paris gathered every exile the Despenser regime had manufactured, and chief among them a man who deserves his sentence of introduction, Roger Mortimer, a great marcher baron who had fought the Despensers, been condemned to die, and then escaped from the Tower of London itself, drugging his guards wine at a banquet on the feast of St. Peter in chains, of all perfectly chosen knights, and going over the wall by a rope to a waiting boat. He was capable, ruthless, and everything Edward was not, and he and Isabella became partners in every sense the chroniclers could imply with raised eyebrows, an open scandal, and an extremely effective military committee. Priced out of France when Edward's diplomacy caught up with her, Isabella simply moved the operation to the county of Hainaut, where she traded her son's marriage to the Count's daughter Philippa, a match the two teenagers, in history's one tender footnote to this story, turned into a famously happy marriage for ships and mercenaries. In September 1326, Isabella and Mortimer landed in Suffolk with a force of perhaps 1,500 men, against a kingdom. It should have been suicide. It was a coronation procession. The regime did not fall, it evaporated. Towns opened their gates. The nobility rode to her banner. London rose for the Queen and hunted the regime's servants through the streets. And Edward and Despenser, abandoned by everyone, fled west into Wales with the treasury and were run down within weeks. For Despenser, captured with the king, there was a show trial and the traitor's end, at Hereford, before a vast and festive crowd, an ending of medieval thoroughness over which we will draw, tonight, a merciful curtain. For Edward, there could be no such simplicity. He was the king, anointed and crowned. And what do you do with a king? What they did had never been done before. In January 1327, an assembly of the realm at Westminster, cajoled, stage-managed, but genuinely broad, resolved that Edward II should reign no more, that he had broken his coronation oath, lost Scotland, robbed his realm, and proven incorrigible, and that the crown should pass to his 14-year-old son. A delegation traveled to the castle where Edward was held and extracted, from a weeping king in a plain black gown, something the age could dress up as consent. It was the first deposition of an anointed English king, the constitutional thunderclap whose echoes would sound for centuries, through every later crisis of crown and parliament, and it had been engineered, in 18 months, by a woman who 2 years earlier had been a pensioner stripped of her children. Within the year came the ending that darkened her legend permanently. Edward of Carnarvon died at Berkeley Castle that September, suddenly, conveniently, aged 43. Murder was universally assumed. The grisly legend every schoolchild eventually hears, the red-hot ending, whispered to make the flesh creep, is almost certainly a later invention, and sober historians note the death was announced, the funeral was royal, and a few even doubt he died at all, for strange tales of a survived, wandering, hermit Edward reached his own son years later. We will leave him, tonight, at peace in his magnificent tomb at Gloucester, which became, in one of history's soft ironies, a pilgrim shrine. As for Isabella, no document ties the queen to any order. What she knew, and when, is a door 8 centuries of historians have knocked on without an answer. What is certain is what she did next, and what it cost her. For 3 years, Isabella and Mortimer ruled England in the young king's name, and power, which she had seized with genius, she wielded with startling greed. She assigned herself the largest queenly estate in English history, signed away Scotland in an unpopular peace, and watched Mortimer swell into precisely the kind of grasping, untouchable favorite they had invaded England to destroy. The wheel, as the medieval mind always insisted, turns. In October 1330, at Nottingham Castle, her son Edward III, 17 now, married, a father, and finished with being governed, came for his own crown. A party of his knights entered the castle at night through a hidden passage in the rock, took Mortimer at sword's point in Isabella's own apartments, and ignored the queen's cry, which chroniclers wrote down and never let history forget, "Fair son, have pity on gentle Mortimer." There was no pity for Mortimer. There was, remarkably, pity for her. Because here is the ending nobody expects from the she-wolf legend, which likes its wicked queens raving in dungeons. Edward III, having executed Mortimer, treated his mother with conspicuous, deliberate mercy. After a short, comfortable house arrest, Isabella was restored to wealth and freedom, castles, manors, an income fit for a dowager queen of France and England, which is what she was. And for 28 more years, nearly half her life, she lived in gilded, busy, entirely unrepentant retirement, keeping splendid court at Castle Rising in Hertford, hunting, hawking, collecting romances of King Arthur, entertaining kings. Her son visited constantly, her grandchildren adored her, reading, said her household books, devotional works and chivalric tales in roughly equal measure, and being consulted, quietly, on French diplomacy, because no one alive understood France better. And her blood, through her, had given her son his claim to it. The 100 Years' War itself would be fought, in part, on the argument that Isabella's son was the rightful heir of the Capots. Only at the very end did the last door close. In her final years she took the habit of the Franciscan Poor Clares, and when she died, in August 1358, past 60, she was buried in their London church, in her wedding mantle, kept for 50 years, and with, tradition long insisted, the heart of Edward II laid upon her breast. Whatever the gesture meant, penance, love, possession, or a Capetian's final immaculate arrangement of appearances, she took the answer with her. The she-wolf name, "You should know as you drift," was pinned on her centuries later, borrowed from Shakespeare's insult to a different queen entirely. Her own century called her, more carefully, Isabella the Fair, a humiliated 12-year-old bride who became the best diplomat of her generation, a stripped and discarded wife who came back with 1,500 men and took an entire kingdom in 6 weeks, the author of the first deposition in English history and of its first great constitutional precedent, and a grandmother reading Arthurian romances by the fire at Castle Rising while Europe trembled at her son. History still cannot decide whether she was a villain, a victim, or simply the only person in her marriage who understood how power actually worked. Perhaps, like her wedding cloak, she was all of it at once, kept carefully for 50 years. Let her rest. And now, at last, let us see to you. And so our night among the queens comes softly to its close. 3 girls, each handed to a stranger with a crown, one who outlived every cage they built for her and died with an open book in her hands, one who walked through an army in the snow and won her war a generation late, through her son, one who was pushed until she pushed back and shook 2 kingdoms, and ended her days by a warm fire with her grandchildren and her romances. And you, your grace, your crown is off now, set down on the table by the bed. The castle is quiet. The fire is burned to a deep, steady glow, and the last candle is guttering low in its holder. Listen, rain, very faint, against the shutters, and far below, the night watch calling that all is well. All is well. Let the bed curtains close around you like the walls of the one kingdom no one can take. Let the day's weight slip from your shoulders, petition by petition, jewel by jewel, layer by layer, the way your ladies unmade the queen tonight and left, underneath it all, just you. Somewhere below, the great hall is dark now, the banners hanging still in the last warmth of the banked fires. The hounds have settled by the hearth. The falcons sleep on their perches in the mews, heads tucked under wings. Out along the walls, the torches gutter one by one, and the snow, perhaps, has begun again, falling soft and unhurried past the tower windows, laying its white cloak over the roofs and the roads and the whole sleeping kingdom, over castle and village, over the abbey where an old queen reads forever with her stone book open, over every road you rode today. 800 years of nights like this one have come and gone, and the castles are quiet now, and the queens are all at rest, and nothing whatsoever is required of you until morning. Let your breathing slow to match the snowfall. Let your eyes grow heavy now, and heavier still, and close. Sleep, your grace. The kingdom will keep until morning. Sweet dreams, and we'll meet again tomorrow night.